Do that. Do that.
And I need to stand right here because the video is being recorded too.
You can come in this area. And it'll keep that messed up.
All right. Well, good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
All right, so my name is Anthony Hood. I'm an assistant professor in the Collette School of Business. I do research on teamwork and its impacts on different types of team outcomes like decision-making, problem-solving, in particular creativity and innovation. So this is my 6th year here on faculty at UAB. Over the last 3 years, I've been getting a little bit more immersed on what we will consider the health side of campus. We're all on the furthest west side of campus where the business school is. But the last 3 years, I've really been kind of immersing myself in how can I take my research and apply it to things like, what's happening in hospitals, what's happening in academic medical centers. So part of my introduction to this side of campus was through the UAB MHRC, the Minority Health and Health Disparities Research Training Program. So I went through that training program. I've also been through the program that you guys are in right now, the Clinical and Translational Science Training Program. And so I found that, all of us are working in teams, whether you're working in patient care or whether you're writing grants or whether you're doing applied or basic science research, we're all having to work with others. And so taking the research that I do, my dissertation really focused on conflict in teams and whether conflict is either beneficial or a detriment to team outcomes. So I've been having a lot of fun and I think I've been adding a lot of value when I do these presentations. So please, I want this to be interactive. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll engage you. So the title of this is Communication, Conflict, Collaboration, and Psychological Safety in Teams. I know that's a mouthful, but we're going to touch on each one of those topics as we go. So some of the things that we're going to touch on, and you guys have some handouts, that Word doc kind of breaks down what are these different types of conflict. One of the things that we found in the management literature is that if you don't know what type of conflict you're having, it's very hard to actually resolve that conflict. So what I want to do today, if nothing else, is equip you with the language to be able to understand what types of disagreements you may be having when you're carrying out your clinical or your translational research, being able to identify that and then maybe move into a much more successful resolution. So we're going to talk about the types of conflict and then how do these conflicts actually manifest in organizations. And then another topic that's very near and dear to my heart is how do we create an environment that is psychologically safe for people to be able to speak up and, to take risks within our environments. And I'll tell you why shortly. And then last, we'll probably finish up with this idea of transactive memory, which is a new field of research that I've been working on. So what is a team? So before we started, I was asking you guys how many of you work in teams, and I was saying that's a trick question because the assumption is we all work in teams. And so this little picture right here is a report from the National Science Foundation Institute of Medicine. They all partnered together and came out with this 250-something page comprehensive systematic review a couple of years ago about how do we enhance the effectiveness of team science. And the way that they define a team in that report is 2 or more individuals with different roles and responsibilities who interact socially and interdependently within an organizational system to perform tasks and accomplish common goals. Big definition, let's break that down. What does that really mean? So oftentimes, I think sometimes when we think about, how many people does it take to make a team, and sometimes we think it takes 4 or 5 people. Actually, you can have 2 people, and 2 people can make a team. So if you work with at least one other person, you have the basis for a team. If those 2 people have different roles and responsibilities, so one person is maybe, doing the front end of the paper, but somebody else is collecting and analyzing the data, and, together you're working together to accomplish an outcome, that's another hallmark of a team. And then you have to interact socially. It's not one of those things where I work in a silo, somebody else works in a silo, we don't communicate, we don't email, we don't text, we don't meet face-to-face. That would be, non-social interaction. But typically we're going to have to interact socially, whether that's face-to-face or virtually mediated communication. And then we have to have interdependence. So interdependence suggests that one person's output makes up somebody else's input. So I can't get my work done until my teammate actually gets their work done. And so the extent to which the overall project is a success is the degree to which people have to depend on others to get part of their work done. We perform within an organizational system, so most of our teams are embedded within a lab that's embedded within a school, which is embedded in a university, so on and so forth. And so we have to take in consideration what are the expectations of the larger organizational system, because that has an impact on what we do and how we do it. And then we have to perform actual tasks, things have to get done, and we have common goals. And as we'll talk about later in this presentation, sometimes we work with people and we don't have shared goals. I've been on projects with people and they bring me in, it's like, Anthony, I want to work with you, but I don't have any money to cover your effort. I'm like, well, in business school, our business model is set up a little bit differently. We don't necessarily have to bring in grant money to cover our effort because we do more teaching than probably other parts of campus. So for me, I'm up for promotion and tenure this year. So my promotion and tenure is primarily based on the amount of peer-reviewed publications I put out. Whether I, bring in any kind of grant funding, that's not going to have any bearing on my promotion and tenure. Other parts of campus I found, it's largely predicated on your amount of grant funding that you bring in. Some parts of campus, you have to actually write a book. And if you don't get your book written, you're not going to get promotion and tenure. So when we engage in these collaborative projects with people outside of our schools, we have to make sure that we're clear on what are the goals that each person has when they're coming into the project, making sure those things are enunciated up front, and then we work towards a shared goal, but also recognize and appreciate the separate goals that everybody has. Okay. Whole bunch of words on this slide. I'm not going to go through all these slides, but this is kind of the different definitions of what we consider team science. So taking that definition of a team that was on the previous slide and applying it to the scientific context, we're all trying to engage in these, discovery projects where we're trying to discover a new procedure, a new intervention. We're trying to understand the effectiveness of different types of treatments. So that's taking teamwork, understanding we have to engage in these discoveries, and how can we accelerate, the extent to which we have these novel and very impactful discoveries that hopefully we can use to get grant funding from the NIH or NSF, and then so on to things like commercialization, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this presentation. So you guys have probably seen this in different types of manifestations, but this is the translational science paradigm. And so what this illustrates is that there's a continuum of translational science that goes from T0 to T4. I've seen it T0 to T5 before. This particular diagram is from the University of Washington. I kind of pulled it off the internet. But translation starts, well, it really doesn't have to start. That's the reason why I pulled this slide, because it put the paradigm in a circle, which kind of signifies that there's really no beginning point and ending. For the sake of simplification, if we start with T0, that's really just that identification of what opportunities that may be out there that could be addressed by our science. So this may be just kind of your basic discovery science. And then you move into T1 where you actually, start to put together, the scientific team, and you start engaging in the science. And this may be your bench research, those of you who are involved in bench research. But then you move to the next stage of translation where you go to T2, where we actually have to assess the efficacy, of a basic discovery. So maybe it's moving from an animal trial into a human clinical, randomized control trial. And then once we find out what works, what intervention is most efficacious, then we move to T3 where we actually put it into practice. So maybe we, do a pilot project within a hospital and we engage a physician that's going to engage in some type of treatment. And so once we figure out what works in that pilot, then maybe we can scale it up to take it to the community and have an impact on public health or global health. Okay? But then once it gets to T4, it doesn't stop, because what happens out in the quote-unquote real world in practice, then we have to feed that back to the basic scientists to further inform the process. So what this illustrates is all of this really is a team. And so some of you are working in T0 research, some of you are in T2, T3. Well, to what extent are we seeing each other as a team across these different phases of the translation paradigm and working together in a way that we can really move science, along this pathway? I think most often the way we're set up right now, we stay in our lane, right? If I'm a basic scientist, I just do basic science research. What happens after that, it's not really my concern. That's just a handoff to somebody else. I think going forward, we're probably going to have to pay a lot more attention to what are the impacts downstream to our research, or what happens upstream. How does it get to me? Things that I read in the journals, where did that information actually come from? Can I start engaging with those people to kind of get a jump on my competition? So this is another diagram, another framework. You guys may be familiar with patient-centered outcomes research, but what this diagram illustrates and what I like about it is that it has the patient at the center of their own care. Around the circle you have maybe the physician, maybe you have the pharmacist, you have the nurse, maybe you have the caregiver, and oftentimes the patient is not at the center. How can we move to a place where we actually see care given as a team, but more importantly, seeing that patient or their caregiver as really the center of their team? It looks good in idealized on paper, but how do we actually implement this in practice? And in practice, this really requires us to leverage the frameworks of the team. This is another diagram when you think about the social determinants of health. There's a lot of research now that says that your zip code probably explains more about your health outcomes than your genetic code. So how can we start really looking at where does a person live? What type of educational system are they in? Do they live in a food desert? How far are they from the nearest hospital or medical facility? And so how can we take an overall assessment of those things in a person's social environment, and then encourage teamwork amongst those different providers, whether it's the person that's educating somebody's children or the person that's handling transportation. How can we make sure that all those things are in place, particularly when a person is discharged from the hospital? We give them a treatment, a care plan. We say, go take this medicine, but do we understand the extent to which they can actually afford the medicine? Do they have the literacy to be able to understand what's been prescribed to them? What about nutrition? All these different things play a part in, health outcomes. And again, this is something that's going to require a much more team approach going forward. Community-based participatory research, some of you may be involved in this, where we actually have to partner with people out in the community to maybe collect data to really understand what's going on in the community. So I know here at UAB we do a lot of work with churches and maybe city officials and things like that to really get a grasp of what's going on out in the community and how do we use that to inform our science. And then more importantly, if we're doing that, we have that collaborative approach to people out in the community, how do we invite them to actually be a part of the research team? Oftentimes we may write in the community partner into the grant, and then the grant gets funded. Maybe we provide some resources, for the data collection or what have you. But what about making the community partner part of the authorship team? How do we recognize that they have expertise, to bring to bear to the actual science? That takes a team-based approach where we're actually recognizing and appreciating what other people are bringing to the table. So there are a lot of frameworks and movements towards community-based participatory research. Now, actually, I am the lead of One Great Community. So One Great Community is the community outreach arm of the UAB CTS. So I am the chair of that this year. So I'm learning a lot more about how do you do community-based research, effectively, and how do you do it in a team-based format. This is from ARC. This is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and so they have a framework that's called Team Steps. And so this has been really effective in hospitals when we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we provide the highest quality of care to our patients and not allow issues about teamwork to negatively impact quality in the hospital. So you guys are familiar with some of the research that says that a lot of people actually contract infections and things like that in the hospital. Hospitals should not be a place where people come to get sick. It should be a place where people come to get well. And so what we're finding is that a lot of the negative outcomes that we find in hospitals is not necessarily related to the equipment or to the science or anything like that. It happens because people are not talking to each other. People are not communicating effectively. People are not speaking up when they see things that are going wrong. And so that actually happens in a team, and we want to make sure that we have the frameworks in place that people feel comfortable working in a team environment and improving patient care quality. So last little framework, and then we'll get more into the meat of the presentation. here at UAB, we have this Office of Interprofessional Simulation. So this Office of Interprofessional Simulation, really looks at these rare occurrences that happen in healthcare organizations and actually provide practice for those people so that when those rare occurrences come up, whether it's a child that's COVID that stopped breathing in the hospital, that may be something that doesn't happen often. How can we come in and have this high fidelity mannequin where people can actually practice on that in a team environment, so I can say, John, I need you to do this. Steve, I need you to go do this. And so we're recognizing people's expertise within the team. We're making sure that we have leadership to direct people to do certain roles that, maybe I'm not, the best person to do the role, but somebody else is. How do we identify expertise within the healthcare team and do it very quickly in order to maximize patient outcome and safety? And this is one of the pictures I took. I did a visit over to the OIPS, and this is one of the mannequins that they use. So this is a simulated infant child that is COVID, stop breathing. And so now they have X number of seconds to get oxygen and get that blood pressure going in order for that patient not to have permanent brain damage. It is an art and science to do this, and I have a really good appreciation of all these different people that are in that room. All of them have to, understand their particular roles and responsibilities as well as the roles and responsibilities of everybody else in that team in order to have that shared outcome of making sure that patient is resuscitated. And so what they'll do, they'll go in on one of the floors in UAB Hospital. They'll commandeer a room. Nobody knows about it. They'll just get an empty room. They'll bring in this mannequin. They have all this computer equipment where they can hit a button and they can stop a pulse. They can do a slow pulse, fast pulse. They can do all these different things with the computer. So there's somebody with like a little kiosk right here with a computer. There's a mannequin over here. And then they'll hit the button. And so when they hit the button that says a patient is coded, everybody that's on that floor in the hospital is supposed to converge in that room. Oftentimes when they get to the room, they're like, oh, this is a drill. But you can't treat it like a drill. You have to treat it like this was an actual, person that is coded. And so through this, they monitor how people are interacting, how people are talking, are they calling out and repeating, different instructions that are coming out. And then after the simulation is over, they do a debrief and they provide, insights on what you could have done more effectively. A lot of this comes down to just communication and coordination. Okay, so the other thing that we're going to talk about today is this, idea of translation. Going back to this previous slide, how do we translate, our findings from T0 to T4 back up to T0? What I suggest, bring some frameworks from the business field, is translation requires at least 4 things. It requires creativity, it requires innovation, it requires entrepreneurship, and also requires strategy. What do these things mean? So creativity is different from innovation. Creativity is really kind of brainstorming and ideation. Creativity happens when typically you have maybe 2 or more people through their interactions that come up with something that's both novel and potentially useful. Okay? But that's just an idea. Sometimes that's in a person's head. Sometimes we may actually put it on paper. How many of you guys have ideas for things that you want to work on? For sure. All right, I do too. I feel like I have 10 of them before breakfast every day. All right. But the problem is we often don't have the resources to be able to engage with all the creative ideas that we have. That leads to the next stage, which is innovation. So innovation is actually implementing the creative ideas or insights that we may have generated, either by ourselves or with somebody else. Okay? So if I just actually try to implement all the ideas that I had, then I'll probably run out of time, I'll probably run out of resources, I'll probably lose my marriage, and my kids will probably hate me because you just don't have time to engage in everything. I have projects that, I've sent to journals, they've gotten rejected, but then I've started new projects, they've gotten rejected, and I have other projects that have gotten R&R. So I got some projects that are just sitting in my desk drawer that have been sitting there for over a year because I just can't get back to them. And so that innovation process is stalled out. Okay? So you have creativity, which is ideation, and then innovation is the implementation of it. Entrepreneurship is different from innovation. So entrepreneurship is how do we really develop a sustainable model to where we can fund the projects that we're working on. So here in the Academic Medical Center, most of the ways that we fund our science and our project is through grant funding. Okay? But entrepreneurship is a framework that we've really been trying to do a lot more of here at CCTS, and particularly through the business school, to say, are there other ways that we could fund our science and other projects other than through federal funding? How many of you know that federal funding is uncertain right now? Okay, so even from a university standpoint, this is a concern to all of us. And we're thinking through how can we diversify our funding sources. And one of the ways that we can diversify our funding sources is through entrepreneurship or commercialization. So I bet if we really kind of sat down with each one of you, I bet each one of you are working on something that has commercialization potential. That could be a startup company, or it could be some type of intellectual property that, maybe we could, license out to somebody else. Everybody in this room is smart. Each one of you probably could take your expertise and develop it to some kind of course that could be sold or something like that. Each one of you could probably go and do some keynote speeches on the weekend and generate funding that you could then use to maybe pay your postdocs and fellows. So entrepreneurship is thinking very creatively about, are there other ways to generate funding to be able to sustain the work that we're working on. And then strategy is different from creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship. Strategy is, once we really get this thing going, how do we keep it going? What's the sustainability part? And more particularly, how do we compete and compete effectively? How many of you guys are working on grants or your projects are funded by grants? Okay. How many of you know that's a competitive process? So strategy is, how do we get a competitive edge over a very crowded field of people just as smart, who have just as much resources as us? When we submit that grant, how do we put forth the best and highest grant possible? And so that requires strategy. Oftentimes that requires a business model, and that's something else that we'll talk about a little bit in this presentation. All right, so I mentioned earlier about conflict, and there are at least 3 types of conflict. So this is kind of what I did my research on. I didn't come up with these concepts. These concepts have been in the field since the early 90s. But what we've understood and we've repeated through our science is that there are at least 3 types of conflict. Okay? There's task conflict, relationship conflict, and process conflict. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm sure that each one of you are having some disagreements or have had some difference of opinion with people in your labs or your projects or what have you. So task conflict is really differences of opinion over ideas and viewpoints. It's not personal. I think we should send this paper to, New England Journal of Medicine, and somebody says, no, I don't think that's it. I think we should send it to a public health journal. We have a difference of opinion. That's what we call task conflict. Okay? Relationship conflict differs from that. Relationship conflict is we just don't get along. Okay? So let's say, for instance, I always cut John off when we're having a team project. And so John's kind of ticked off, like, man, I can't get a word in because Anthony always cuts me off. That's generating relationship conflict. Or maybe half of our team are extroverts and the other half are introverts. Okay, and so that's causing some friction. So relationship conflict is really disagreements based on interpersonal incompatibilities, and oftentimes leads to frustration and annoyance. Sometimes people undermine each other. I know you've never seen this before your work, but sometimes people will actually intentionally undermine others and make them look bad, for whatever reason. Okay? And then the last type of conflict is process conflict. So process conflict could be, look, we're in agreement over what we need to do. We know that we need to do, problem solution A. The conflict comes in is how to actually get it done. Okay? So process conflict sometimes, is related to, workload sharing. I feel like I'm doing most of the work and somebody else is not pulling their weight. That's a process conflict. Or, John, I thought you were going to do, the methods. And John's like, no, you said you were going to do the methods. So now we have a process conflict of who was supposed to do what, or maybe it's conflicts over resources. Somebody gets the better office than somebody else, or somebody else is using up all the resources within the lab. That's a process conflict. Okay? So if you don't leave with anything else today, I want you to think about the last several disagreements that you've had with other people within your team. What type of conflict was it really? Was it a task conflict? Was it a relationship conflict? Or was it a process conflict? And like I said earlier, if you don't know what type of conflict you're having, you're not going to be able to solve it effectively. And so what we've been working on is how do we equip people in science teams to recognize the type of conflict and then to be able to resolve it with them. So there are 5 manifestations of these 3 types of conflict. Conflicts can be skewed, they can be asymmetric, they can be transformed, multiplex, and contagious. Bunch of big words. I'm going to break some of them down right now. Okay? So think about the types of conflicts that have had maybe in some of the projects that you're working on. So all of our projects have a project cycle where they start at one point and maybe they carry out over months. Sometimes they carry out over years, particularly those of you who are on these 3-year grants. Think about when we first started working on the project. Sometimes conflicts only happen between a couple people within the team. So this is an example of one team in 3 phases of the project. So on the far left, you have what's called a dyadic conflict. So a dyadic conflict occurs when maybe there are only 2 people that have some type of disagreement. Person B and person E. This is a 6-person team. Okay? So I'm sure you guys have seen this before. You know, everything was fine until that last person entered the room, and then they entered the room, and you know they have this fundamental ideological disposition with somebody else that's in the team. And so whenever these 2 people get in the team, they're always going to clash, right? You've seen this before, I'm sure. Okay? So now we have this dyadic conflict. But what happens sometimes is maybe person B and D are friends, and maybe person C and E are friends. And so for the simple fact that persons B and E are in a conflict, that pulls other people into the conflict. Okay? So John is my friend, but John is having a disagreement with somebody else. I feel compelled to come to John's rescue and to side with John. Even if I don't agree with him, that's my homeboy. And so because he's my homeboy, then I got to back him up. Now we can solve it after the team is over, after the project, after we get out of the team discussion. But for right now, I'm going to engage with him. Now, imagine person A. Person A may be the actual leader of a team. And so person A is probably like, guys, we don't have time for all this conflict. You guys need to resolve it. So person A is ticked off at these 2 factions that have developed between B and D and then C and E. Okay? And so what happens is maybe person A thinks that this is a personal conflict. But maybe persons B and D think that they have a task conflict with person C and E. And maybe person C and E see it as a process conflict. So one person thinks that it's a conflict over what needs to be done. Somebody else may be thinking that I'm clear on what needs to be done. It's who's going to do it. And then somebody else might be like, you guys are just stupid. You're engaging in conflict because of interpersonal incompatibilities. This could be based on gender. It could be the women in the team are having conflicts with the men in the team because they feel like, they're being disenfranchised. Okay? So this happens all the time. And then what happens if these conflicts are not adequately resolved, then by the time, we get to stage 3, everybody's in conflict. Because notice right here in time 2, person F is just sitting here like, they don't have a dog in the fight. It's like, you know what, I'm just really ready to get off. Also, we're having beers with the fellows after this team project is over. So they're ready to leave. And now person F is drawn into the conflict. Okay? So this is what happens oftentimes when projects get derailed, is that people don't understand what types of conflict they're having, or conflicts break up into subgroups. I'm going to skip this slide. Conflicts can also be asymmetric. So this is another thing that I did my dissertation on and research that I've been working on lately, is that conflicts can be asymmetric such that one person may perceive that there's a conflict with another, but the other person doesn't perceive the conflict back. Okay? So the red lines here indicate conflict. Okay, so this is actual data from some teams that we collected data from. These are all 4-person teams. And so what happened in these teams, we gave each one of the people a survey at different points on their team projects. And we asked each person, tell me to what extent did you have conflict with each other person within your team. So for instance, person 1, would report on how much conflict they had with person 2, how much conflict they had with person 3, how much conflict they had with person 4. We also asked them, who did you see as a friend within the team? And they reported the level of friendship with each person on the team. Okay? So the direction of that arrow matters because that's an indication of what that person said about the other person. So what do you notice about persons 1 and 2?
person one really doesn't have any friends with anybody, while person
Well, just before you get there, just saying, between 1 and 2, what do you notice?
person two has friends I had a couple of times.
Yes, so person 2 reported that person 1 is my friend, but I'm also having conflict with that person. This was kind of mind-blowing to me when I was collecting this data for my dissertation, because you would assume that if a person is friends with another person, they're probably less likely to have conflict with them. But that's probably an unrealistic expectation. You know, we oftentimes work with people that we're friends with, but if we're working in a project and it's a project that we care strongly about, there are probably times where we're going to have conflict, and we might have all 3 types of conflict: task conflict, relational conflict, and process conflict. Okay, so as you mentioned, person 2 reported, I am friends with person number 1, and we also had conflict when we were working on our project. Now, what did person 1 say about person 2? Person's not my friend and we're not having conflict. So how is it that I say that you're my friend, but you're not saying you're my friend back? That's a problem in and of itself, right? And you've probably experienced this before, where people, have made these overtures to you like, hey man, why don't you come over to my house? I'm going to barbecue this weekend or whatever. You're thinking, doesn't he know I don't like him? Like, why is he inviting me to have lunch with him and go to the ball game? He's giving me tickets. This happens all the time when we're working in organizations where people have different perceptions of the extent to which they are friends. They also have different perceptions of the extent to which they're having conflicts or not. So person number 1 didn't even perceive that there was a conflict there. This happens. Sometimes this happens with our managers, right? Our managers think that, everything is fine, and we're thinking, I hate your guts, right? And so if we don't know that somebody else actually perceives conflict with us, then we're not in a position to actually do something about it, okay? Person number 2 may think, hey, I'm having conflict with this person, and they may assume that person number 1 knows that the conflict is actually there. And if person number 1 doesn't know that the conflict is there, maybe I'm making overtures to John to say, hey, we need to resolve this conflict, and John is totally oblivious to it. And that's what happens sometimes. Sometimes people are just so busy that they don't recognize that there's conflict there. Or maybe they discount the extent to which there is conflict. How many times have people said something to you that really offended you? They didn't see it as offensive, but you saw it as offensive. Okay? So this happens in organizations. So person number 2 says, 1 is both my friend and we're having conflict. Person 2 only has 2 friendships within this team. Okay? And they don't have any friendships or have any conflicts with person 3. And person 3 is actually having what we call a symmetric conflict with person 4. So person 3 says, I'm having conflict with this person. Person 4 says, yes, I'm having conflict with this person. So what I argued in my research is that this is probably preferable when both people report that there's conflict versus if only one person within a dyad reports that there's conflict. Because if you don't know that there's conflict there, then you can't resolve it. Yes, sir.
Sorry if this is a side note, but did you find in your research that an asymmetric friend tie and an asymmetric conflict tie often went together? Just what we just
I think that they did tend to coexist. Yeah, they did coexist. Now, what we looked at in these particular 3 teams that I pulled out, which of these 3 teams do you think had the highest levels of performance? So these were student teams working on a semester-long business simulation where they simulated the top management team of a global company selling tennis shoes. Okay, so what you find here, let me give you some other background. Each of these 3 teams had the same number of friendships, the same number of conflicts. The only thing that differs is who's having conflict with who and who's having friends with who. So in team number 1, the conflicts are happening between people that said that they were friends. They're also happening between people who did not indicate that there was friendship. In team number 2, all the conflicts happened with people who did not report that there's friendship. And team number 3, all the conflicts happened amongst people who said that they were friends. Okay, so that was the other thing that we were interested in. Is it better that conflicts occur between people who are friends or people who are not friends? So which of these 3 teams do you think had the highest numbers of performance?
Team C.
Why team C?
If they are friends and they have conflict,
they can improve the result. Look like they're hurting each other.
I was just saying, it looks like the person that's not involved, you know, I mean, so maybe they were a tighter group, just with three talking about everything. You know, having a conflict with somebody that wasn't really engaged or anything. Yes.
I was thinking just to brainstorm that TV might be more productive because everyone's engaged in some way.
Okay. So what we actually found in our research is Team B at the highest levels of performance. And so what the theory that we came up with is this multiplex theory of friendship and conflict. And so what this theory, suggests is that when conflicts happen between people who are friends, that's a much more resource-intensive type of interaction. To where, if you and I are friends and we have a conflict, I'm going to invest more energy in that interaction to make sure that I don't harm the friendship. And so friends are going to work really, really hard to have a disagreement without having long-term impacts to the friendship. How that plays out in our organization is that it ends up making us spend more time on our projects than necessary. And then oftentimes we'll dance around situations where we're having conflict with our friends and we're not as straightforward about, our ideas, our viewpoints, and our opinions. Now, you contrast that when conflicts happen between people who are not friends. We don't know each other. I just say, dude, that's a dumb idea. Let's come up with another idea. And we just have a conflict, but that conflict is streamlined and allows us to engage in the type of vetting and intellectual friction required in order for us to come up with our highest and best solutions to the problems or the decisions that we're working on. And so we found this over and over in our research is that if there's going to be conflict, it needs to happen between people who are not friends. If the conflict that happens between people who are friends, it's going to be resource exhaustive and it's going to have an overall long-term negative effect on team performance. Okay? So this was amongst student teams, and so now we're trying to replicate this amongst people out in the quote-unquote real world and software teams and manufacturing organizations, and hopefully within academic medical centers to see how does this play out maybe in an operating room to where you have nurses or you have physicians that have developed these really strong bonds of friendship because they work with each other for several years. Are they able to, engage in some type of intellectual friction at the point of care to where if there's a surgery going on and I see John is engaging in a practice that we found that it's an unsafe practice, can I call John out about that? And if I do call John out about that, is he going to feel some kind of way about it because I've embarrassed him amongst his peers? Or what about when we have these power differentials within our teams to where maybe you have a head surgeon or a head nurse and you have somebody else that's junior, maybe they're a resident or a postdoc or maybe just, a student. Do they feel empowered and feel safe to actually engage in a disagreement with somebody that has a higher status position within that team? These are things that oftentimes we're not equipping our students with when they're students, when they're postdocs, when they're residents. They feel like they have to reach a certain point before they feel comfortable speaking up. Even me, I'm an untenured faculty, so there have been times where I've been in, faculty, meetings, and there are things that have come up that I didn't agree with, but I'm like, you know what, I'm the untenured guy, I better keep my mouth shut because at the end of the day, it's a subjective process, right? And so when you have a lot of subjectivity in your organization, you have a tendency to maybe be a lot more reserved and not bring out things that probably if you brought them out, it would really force the team to rethink, their problems or their decisions and then maybe come up with a higher, better solution. So this is just another slide to kind of illustrate that sometimes, when we look at these conflict asymmetries or friendship asymmetries, sometimes these are related to underestimations or overestimations. Sometimes people may agree that they are friends or they may agree that there's conflict there, but maybe one person has overestimated, the intensity of the friendship or the conflict, whereas somebody else may have underestimated that. And so how do we make sure that people have, equal amounts of perceptions of the interactions that they're having within teams? Because we don't make sure that there's balance between the perceptual, the perception that people are having, you're going to have these asymmetries that are going to lead to lower levels of team performance. Yes?
Would you say that this is a bit of an argument for having the multidisciplinary teams that you really don't have close ties or affiliations with? so that you can have healthy conflict that perhaps you don't have to invest quite as much energy and be more effective?
Yeah, so the research certainly suggests that we're going to have more task conflict when we have multidisciplinary teams because people come to the table with different languages, different approaches to how they're doing things. But that's how we come up with our most creative and innovative solutions. But how do we then manage those task conflicts that come up? So if we don't have the same background, maybe there's still a honeymoon period where we kind of get to know each other. I don't want to be the jerk. I don't want to be in the first meeting and then I'm having disagreements with everybody. So there's probably a phased approach where we get to a probably an optimal place where task conflict is probably going to be most effective. That's another thing that the literature suggests is that task conflict has this inverse U-shaped relationship with performance to where in the beginning stages, task conflict is good for team performance, but it comes to a point where there's diminishing returns to where any further task conflicts is going to reduce team performance. So again, understanding how that intersects with friendship and with tenure in the relationship is kind of uncharted territory, I think, in the research field. But these are some things that I'm working on right now. Thank you. So I mentioned this idea of psychological safety. So psychological safety is really the extent to which people feel comfortable engaging in interpersonally risky behaviors within our team. So what are interpersonally risky behaviors? So interpersonally risky behaviors is anytime, maybe you want to admit an error that you made. There have been times where, I had a lot of training in empirical methods. So I'm typically the one that analyzes the data in my group projects. There have been times where I was like, oh, we got a significant p-value. We write up the front end of the paper. We got the paper ready to go. And then I go to replicate it and I realize, oh, I made a mistake. And then what I thought was a significant value, I thought the p was 0.03, the p is really 0.30. I'm like, I have to go back to my team, like, guys, I messed up. We really don't have it. So if we've invested 6 months in getting this project ready to go out to a journal, and then I have to come back to my co-author and say, hey, I messed up on the project, what impact does that have on me professionally? Am I going to look incompetent? Am I going to look like somebody that's dependable and reliable? Am I going to be invited to work on other projects with my co-authors? And so if I perceive that if I admit an error that I made that it's going to have a serious negative impact on me personally, on me professionally, maybe I won't say anything about it. Because at the end of the day, I'm the only one to analyze the data. Nobody's going to come back and check behind me, right? But we've seen all these different retractions that have happened in a lot of journals, lately where people are asking for data and they're analyzing the data and they can't replicate it, then that could look very negatively, not only on you, but the entire team. So what impact does that have on you professionally going forward if you've engaged in a practice that you didn't speak up about an error that you made? What about asking for help? Are we working in team environments where if you ask for help, then you're perceived as somebody that's lazy or somebody that's incompetent or just not a hard worker? Particularly when we're students and we're junior faculty, we feel like we just got to bust our butts. If our advisor says, hey, I need you to get this done, I need it by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you're thinking, okay, I got to pull all-nighter. Can I go back to my advisor or, my person that's over my lab and say, hey, I really can't get this done, I need more time, or maybe there's other people that maybe you can assign to me to kind of get this work done. Have we created an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up about that? And then challenging, questioning, and vetting. This is what we've been talking about is, can I speak up about something that I perceive as unethical or as a low quality or unsafe practice? Do I feel comfortable speaking up, particularly if I'm somebody that's junior in the team, or maybe I'm from a marginalized group. Maybe I'm a racial minority, maybe I'm a female, and I just don't feel comfortable speaking up about it. Maybe I'm from an international background, and so I feel compelled to show that I'm twice as good as everybody else. And so, this may have an impact on my perception of psychological safety. So psychological safety is something that an individual perceives, but it's contingent upon the environment that has been set by the team members and more particularly by the leadership, and then maybe by the policies and procedures of the organization. Sometimes we can create policies and procedures in the organization that creates an environment of psychological unsafety. Take the banking industry. Wells Fargo was dinged last year because they created these policies that really require their salespeople to, have these high sales targets, and they started making up accounts just to hit their numbers. Okay. Why didn't anybody speak up about that? Or last week, you guys were familiar with the United Airlines incident, right? Where they end up dragging this poor guy off of his airplane. You know, like, why didn't somebody speak up about this policy or practice before it got to the place where somebody actually had to be physically dragged off of a plane? You know, at some point you have to think, why didn't anybody think about that? Maybe somebody did think about what's the worst that could happen, and they just didn't speak up about it. And if they didn't speak up about it, is it because they didn't feel comfortable speaking up about it? What happens when we speak up about things, about us needing help, or there's a bad decision, or there's something unsafe, or, you know, I've made a mistake? What happens? Do I feel devalued if I do that? Will the people in the team distort, my plea for help and distort it in a way that makes me look bad? Or maybe somebody is discounting my expertise. So sometimes, we have this, perception of pedigree within academic medical centers, based on where you got your degree from or who you studied on. And so if you didn't go to the right school, you didn't study on the right person, or you don't have the right degree, sometimes there's a discounting of people's expertise. And there's a discount that also makes us feel psychologically unsafe. And then what happens if we engage in these behaviors and then we get rejected by our team members or by our leadership? All it takes is one time for that to happen and you shut somebody down. One time for a person to say, hey guys, I messed up, we're going to have to pull that paper back because the methods are wrong. And somebody's like, oh God, why did somebody let him do the methods? Or the next time we're in a project, somebody says, all right, you remember the last time Anthony did the methods, he messed them up. So somebody needs to go behind Anthony to make sure he did it right. What impact does that have on, my confidence and my psychological safety if people are constantly double checking me and going behind me because I spoke up about something that I made a mistake in the past? Any questions or comments about that? You guys seen this before? Yeah.
So if you're in a team where there are superior members or more esteemed members, and they don't want to create a psychologically safe environment, is there a way to get around?
A couple things you can do. One of the things you can do is what we call manage up, right? Sometimes, our leaders manage us, but sometimes we have to manage our leaders. And, so that's tricky because if they've already created a psychologically safe environment, it really takes a lot of courage to be able to go to that person and say, hey, I really want to talk to you about some things. Maybe the way that you have conflict with people when we're in a team environment, you have a tendency to berate people. And I just don't think that's fair. Can you do that? What are the implications of doing that? Sometimes maybe it's going to one of their peers and talking to one of their peers about it, and then maybe that peer can have a conversation with that person and maybe help in that environment. So I was an engineer for 10 years at AT&T before I came to academia, and so at AT&T we always had skip level meetings every year to where we always met with our boss's boss. It was always confidential, and you could always just share what you wanted with the boss's boss, and then they can in turn go back, to their direct reports. I don't know to what extent we created that kind of environment here at UAB, but maybe that's something that, if that's not there, maybe we can suggest that to upper level leadership to have these skip level meetings to where we can actually have those conversations with higher level people. I don't know that I gave you really good solutions to that, but
That's good thoughts. It seems like, if you have a sort of asymmetric, say in the way that things move forward, then the people at the top aren't willing to create this environment, then you're sort of subjected to these less than ideal practices for fear of those things happening.
Yeah, so another thing I study is turnover. And so that's certainly a factor that's going to, precipitate people to leave the organization. Sometimes people will find another lab to go to, they'll find another project to get on. Sometimes they leave the entire system altogether. And so I actually seen this at UAB where you start having this mass exodus of people out of certain centers or certain labs or whatever. At some point, somebody has to look at the leadership and be like, why doesn't anybody want to work with you? Why is there so much turnover, in your work group? So just looking at the amount of turnover, or sometimes people stay, but they're not engaged and they're not productive. So it's another thing is like, why is it that when I look at everybody else's performance, this particular lab always has the lowest level of performance, the highest levels of unsafe, low quality practices, It could be that the people are so disengaged because of these asymmetries that maybe they're actually engaging in sabotage. And so we find that oftentimes in organizations where people are actually intentionally sabotaging their leaders or they're sabotaging the organization because they don't feel, respected in the organization. Yes.
Just a comment, I had a situation, I don't know what you're dealing with, but while I was writing my dissertation, where I felt that it is an example of managing up, because I might go to one person on my team that would say one thing, or another person on the team saying something else, and it may have been a conflict. So what I found helpful was to bring everyone together.
Yeah.
And to play the student, so to speak, and just ask, so what if I did this, or what if I did that, or, trying to get people to speak to one another.
Yes.
So that the committee would come to consensus, rather, because I could often feel caught in the middle.
Yeah, I mentor a lot of students, and we have those conversations, particularly when they're putting together like their dissertation committees, because that's one of those things where I left academia I left corporate America because of politics. Thinking that, surely there are no politics in academia. I didn't know. I was naive. There's so many politics that are involved, particularly when people are going through like dissertations, right? And so I've had to counsel students be like, okay, if you put this person on your committee, you can't put this person on the committee. Why not? Because they don't like each other and they're going to use you as a pawn. So, or this person is a senior, tenured faculty member, but they're going to derail everything else. So can you actually make the junior person your dissertation chair? Because at the end of the day, they have to go up for tenure at some point, and they're not going to go to bat for you against this person who is the senior tenure person. So, as a student, there's a lot of pressure on you to really understand the nuances of the faculty members and to put together a team that ultimately is going to lead you to actually getting done at some point, and you're not going to have to stay here 3 years working on a dissertation. So a lot of it just comes with what we just call network intelligence. So network intelligence is really kind of understanding the quality of the interactions amongst the people within your environment and building teams such that, even our science projects, we're working on a grant, you have to understand there are some people that if you bring them on the project, it's going to slow down the project. Even though that person is really, really talented, they just don't get along with other people. And so how do we manage that person's expertise as well as their personality? And sometimes that's trial and error. Sometimes that's learning from other people who have been there longer than you how to actually navigate, those interpersonal nuances. So another tool that I've used to really kind of identify, what expertise do we have within the team, who's within our organization, and who needs to do what, is this idea of transactive memory. Let me clarify. I didn't develop the concept of transactive memory systems, but what I've done is try to create tools through which we can use this theory to improve our team performance. So this theory of transactive memory suggests that oftentimes we'll share the responsibilities of processing information within our teams, such that I'm going to specialize in one area, somebody else is going to specialize in a different area. And so to the degree that we have these specialized roles and responsibilities, it allows each person to take a deep dive and ownership of one expertise domain without feeling compelled to manage expertise across multiple domains. So the benefit of that is, as a team, we can develop very deep expertise and knowledge in a lot of different expertise domains. The downside is there's a siloing effect. And so academic medical centers, we have a lot of silos, right? We are over in business, we're way on the west side of campus, and some of my colleagues never leave the business school, and they're probably colleagues in your particular school where they really don't interact with people outside of their schools. Even within my school, people may say they're engaged in interdisciplinary research. Well, technically, if you have an accounting faculty member that's partnering with somebody in finance and somebody that's partnering in economics, you can call that cross-disciplinary, and I guess it is, but it's all still business. But what happens if you develop a team with somebody that's from business and somebody from engineering and somebody from veterinary science and somebody from dentistry? What type of project could that team develop? I bet you it would be novel, right? Now, the thing is, how do we bring these expertise together in a manner that comes up with something that's very novel but also potentially useful? So oftentimes in our teams, when we're developing our projects, we have to have an understanding of who else is out there that could be brought onto the team in order to get us to a higher level of creativity and innovation, particularly when we have to compete for these grants and you know, the limited amounts of pages that are in these journals. Because a lot of our journals, you know, they have what, 90% rejection rate. So, you know, what are the chances of you being able to get your paper in some of these top level journals is going to require novelty and creativity. So let me give you an example of how to use this tool in this theory. So there are some times where we have asymmetric perceptions of what needs to be done on our project. Okay? Sometimes we may not realize that this is a project and we're going to be using a community-based participatory research approach. Okay? So we probably start with what needs to be done. We need somebody that's going to do grantsmanship. We need somebody that's going to analyze the data. We need somebody that knows how to go out to an organization and develop coalitions amongst pastors and neighborhood leaders. We need somebody that really knows how to navigate the peer review process. Maybe we need somebody that's actually going to go out and do health screenings and maybe do swabs and maybe take some blood draws. Maybe we need to do some qualitative surveys amongst people. Now, I'm a quantitative person. I don't know how to do qualitative research, okay? I tend to avoid it like the plague, okay? I just need numbers and Likert scales so I can put into a regression analysis. That's my thing. But maybe the project that we need to work on really requires a mixed method where we need to do qualitative and quantitative, okay? So I may know that we need to do qualitative surveys, but I don't know somebody that actually does qualitative research. And so what happens is we have a gap within our team that we need to go out and identify somebody that can do the qualitative part. Maybe we know that we need to get some grant funding for our project, and maybe we know that, you know, Susan says, hey, guys, I'll write the grant. But what if Susan's never written a grant before? And so we're really unclear about Susan's expertise in grant writing. Don't raise your hand, but has that ever happened to you to where somebody has volunteered to do something on your team and you look up and you're like, I didn't know you did that. When have you ever done that? And if it's a project that really requires that, you may start to, you know, second guess and, you know, double check behind that person, which again may create a psychologically unsafe environment because you're just not confident in that person's ability to do what they volunteered to do. And so how can we assure ourselves that a person really can get done what they say that they're going to get done? So this happens all the time. Or maybe we know that Karen is on our team. We know that Karen has expertise in doing health disparities, but maybe the project doesn't require anything having to do with health disparities. So don't raise your hands, but has this ever happened to you where there are people on the team and you're just kind of wondering why they're on the team? You know that they're an expert in a certain area. You just don't have anything for them to do. Do you just put them on a project? Does their name get put on a project just because they're a member of the lab, even though they haven't actually done anything, and you don't actually have a defined role for them? You know, has your senior author ever said, well, you know what, I'm going to put John on this paper? Well, what is John going to do? Oh, well, he needs a publication. But what is he going to do? Like, he has to earn authorship, right? I know it's never happened to you. I know you've never seen it before. I'm just saying this happens sometimes, okay? So when stuff like that happens, it may cause me to look at John and be like, you know, John's just on here because, you know, he's friends with the senior person, whatever. Nobody ever put me on the paper, but then he just comes in the door. He gets put on the paper. So now what happens is we have a process conflict that has devolved into a relationship conflict. And so that's another manifestation of conflict, is that sometimes conflicts can be transformed to whereas what may have started as a process conflict may end up being a relationship conflict. Or there's a conflict to where maybe John and I don't get along and we're working on a project and I come up with an idea. John shoots down the idea, not because it's a bad idea, it's because John doesn't like it. And so what happens is that relationship conflict has transformed into a task conflict. And so I want you guys to just kind of think about some of the, you know, maybe the difficult things that have happened between, you know, people within your teams. Is that what's happening? Is it happening because people are not perceiving the type of conflict that's happening? Is it because one conflict transformed into another type of conflict? Did somebody discount or disregard somebody else's expertise? Did we not know who was supposed to do what? Or maybe we just can't find anybody to do a part of the project. And so maybe we assign Chris to not only do the health screening, but also do qualitative surveys, but Chris really doesn't have a background in doing that. But he does it because there's nobody actually there to do it. And so now Chris is having a process conflict because he feels overwhelmed because he's having to do all this stuff. He has to learn a new technique that he hasn't been trained and equipped to do. This happens a lot of times in our science. It happens oftentimes just in our other clinical work as well. So a lot of this really needs to come down from the leadership. You need to have a leader that really understands who does what, who can do what, who's missing, what type of resources do I need to mobilize in order to get the right person in the right place to do things on a project. And sometimes that's the formal leader that needs to do that, but sometimes it's the informal leader. I know all you guys are probably working on projects where on paper, when you look at the org chart, there is a particular leader of the organization, but maybe that person is so busy that there's somebody else, one of your peers, rises up, and that's the person that everybody goes to for leadership. Okay? So can that leader then mobilize the people, the tasks, and the resources necessary in order to make sure that our projects go forward? That's this era of team science, to where how can we really take data points and understand what's going on in our organizations, and then maybe offer some prescriptions on what really makes a high quality team, and how do we construct a high quality team. Now, spoiler alert, we're not there yet. Okay, so I know sometimes people ask me like, okay, so what's the best way to construct a team? And to be honest with you, we really haven't gotten that down to a science yet. We're working on it, but we're not there yet. But we do have some nuggets to get us into that place. Right now, a lot of it's just kind of retrospective. We can look at why, a team that performed well, a team that didn't perform well. We can analyze them post hoc and find out why the team performed well. But then sometimes we apply that to another setting, doesn't even work out. So we're working in that direction. So one more tool, and then we'll finish up with this. This is what's called the business model canvas. This is a tool that we use, particularly with teams that are going through a commercialization process. And what I found that this tool is really good to make sure that people within a team are on the same page. We go back to that translational continuum from T0 to T4. This is a tool to make sure that there's some continuity across all those different phases of the team project. So, taking from a business standpoint, each one of us is working on projects where there's a customer. Okay? Business, we call it a customer. In you guys' terminology, maybe it's your research subjects. Maybe that customer is the person that's actually receiving care or receiving treatment. Maybe it's a particular patient population based on demographics or maybe some kind of disease category. Sometimes if we're writing a grant, maybe that customer is the peer reviewers or that grant panel that's going to actually be scoring your grant. And so this customer standpoint says, we need to make sure that we're clear on what it is that they want to see, and then we can develop a project that helps that customer meet some type of need or something like that. So understanding, who we're actually developing the project for is very key to make sure that we have really good team performance. Also, we need to understand what is the problem that the actual customer is having. So again, identifying the customer first, then understanding what is their problem, what is their condition or their diagnosis or what have you. So are we treating, African American females that are encountering breast cancer, or their breast cancer survivorship? So what's the condition or the diagnosis? If we're working with a community-based partner and we're going out and we're engaging with a large church because they have 1,000 members and we're saying, ooh, that's a lot of research subjects, we have to understand, yeah, we want to get a partnership with them so that we can include them on the grant, but what do they want out of it? What's the problem that they are encountering that they need addressing? So is it because they live in a food desert? Maybe they're dealing with crime. Maybe they're dealing with a lot of blight in and around their church. And so looking at them as a customer and understanding what their problem is helps us to be able to understand, what are the areas of mutual interest amongst us so that we can develop a really good team project. And then also we need to understand what's the prevalence, the severity, or the frequency of the problem that people are having. If we're dealing with physicians or caregivers, what are the challenges that they may be encountering? If we're just writing a paper for a journal, then what are the gaps in theory or practice that need to be resolved? Okay. So let me go back one second. What does this look like? When I'm doing these engagements with teams, what this may look like is taking one of these, blowing it up into a poster, put it up on a wall, giving each one of the people within a team one of these individual diagrams, giving them sticky notes, and then I'll take them through each one of these boxes, and they will actually write down bullet points as to, if you're working on a project right now as a team, who do you see as the customer? What do you see as the problem? So on and so forth. What happens more times than not, I'll go through this entire exercise with one particular team, and that team may have been working together for quite a while. They'll fill out these sticky notes for each one of their individual documents, and then they'll take the sticky notes, and then we'll all come up to the board, and then they all put their sticky notes up here on the poster. What do you think happens? All team members working on the same team.
They come up with different ideas in the same box.
Yes. So they ask them who's the customer. One person said, well, I thought the customer is X. Well, I thought the customer is Y. But they've been working on the same project for 6 months. But they have asymmetric perceptions. Or maybe they're clear on who the customer is, but they're unclear on what is the problem that the customer actually has. And if you don't know what problem the patient or the patient population or whoever is having, then you're not going to be able to develop an effective solution to be able to adequately address the problem. And so how do we make sure there's clarity up front when we're in the planning stages of the project before we move into implementation? Because if we're unclear in the planning stages, what's going to happen is that we're going to create an environment where there's going to be conflict and there may be psychological unsafety and there's a derailment of the project, or you may finish the project but you didn't finish it at the highest levels of performance that you could have. Okay, so this is a tool that this is how I typically use that tool. So I'm going to go back in, I'm going to go through it just really quickly, and then we have questions we can go back to. So competition. Competition is understanding for that particular customer with that particular problem, we are developing something that's both novel and potentially useful, right? Particularly we're trying to get a grant. We're trying to come up with something that's really kind of never been done. We're trying to iterate on something that's already out there. What is the thing that's already out there? So if we're doing a paper, this would be probably come up in our lit review. Our lit review is kind of understanding what's already been done and how is what we're proposing different from what's already out there. So that's what we call the competition or the alternatives. So if we're at the point of care, maybe we're doing a systematic review of some of the best practices. So what are the best practices that are out there, and are we proposing something that's a improvement upon whatever best practices already out there? Okay. And our solution is, what is it that we're actually developing? And being very clear about, we are developing X. Whether that X is an intervention, maybe that X is, a new theoretical paper. What is X? Maybe it's a, new treatment, plan for somebody, or maybe it's something out in the community where we're actually delivering something to a community partner that's going to help them with the problem that we identified in one of the previous boxes. So that's our solution. And then the other thing is, so what? What's the benefit if we actually are successful in getting this solution funded, getting the solution off the ground, getting this solution implemented? What's going to be the benefit to the customer? And I think this is where what I've seen, how we run afoul with people out in the community. I'm sure all of you have heard these criticisms to where, at academic medical centers, UAB is no exception, where we need patients, we need subjects, we go out to the community, we develop relationships with folks, we get a grant funded, we go out and we engage with them for a while, and then when the grant runs out, then we pull out. And so we spent all this time developing relationships, we built trust with our community partners, but then when the grant runs out, we pull out and we really haven't created some kind of sustainable way that we can continue to help these folks. And so understanding that mutual benefit, understanding what they want, what the patient population wants or the community partner wants, is very key to think about up front before we submit the grant. We don't want to think about that after we've got the grant funding, after we allocated the funding, and now we're in year 3 and we're thinking about renewing or we're not going to renew, and then we have to think about, okay, so how are we going to keep this thing going for X? Or how are we going to translate this from T3 over to T4, and what impact is it going to have for somebody else down the translational continuum? These are things that I argue we need to be thinking about up front. Now the question is, maybe our project right now is really only composed of T2 and T3 types of researchers. Well, maybe we need to find the person that's in T4, T5, the person that's actually at the point of care that's in practice, or T5, the person that's actually doing population health and global health, bringing them onto the team up front so they can help inform the project before we actually submit it somewhere. That's a next level of team science, and that's a level that we have to get to. We're not there yet, but taking a team-based approach, hopefully we'll get to that place. And then what's our advantage? This goes back to that whole part of strategy and sustainability. You know, what is our sustainability plan? You know, and making sure that, you know, if we need to enroll subjects, how are we going to keep enrolling subjects, and the ones who are already in the study, how do we keep them in the study? So again, understanding why they actually participate. You know, understanding, you know, what is the advantage that we have over, you know, things that are already out there. You know, why should they fund our science? If we're sending something to the NIH or the NSF, why should they fund us over any other projects that they already have out there? The message is the brand. What do we stand for? Who do we see ourselves as? You know, this could help in making sure that we reduce conflict by making sure people have a shared identity within our team. You know, I don't know if you guys work in teams or environments, but do you guys give yourselves a name? We are Team Grants, or, you know, whatever. We are Team whatever. Maybe we get some logo branded t-shirts or whatever. You know, I've seen people that have the X Lab, whatever X is. You know, can you create a very fun and, you know, rewarding environment where people want to build relationships with their teammates, they want to be respectful, they want to create a psychologically safe environment? You know, does the leader do that, or do, you know, all the other team members do that? And is there a benefit to that? Now, granted, we probably all work in different types of teams. I'm probably working on X number of projects. Let's say that I'm working on 7 projects, and none of those projects contain all the same people. Okay, so it may be unrealistic that each one of my teams is going to have their own separate identity. But maybe that's a place that we need to go to in order for us to develop the trust and the positive relationship necessary in order to magnify our team projects. Distribution. So the distribution is really being very clear on how are we going to disseminate and implement the findings from our project. You know, more than just we did a really good project, we had some significant results, we published it, you know, in a journal, then what? You know, how do we then communicate and translate that to a broader audience? So I know in business, and I don't know in you guys' journals, but in business, we are starting to go to a place where the journals are really encouraging us to do like video abstracts. So we publish the article, but then they want us to do maybe a 3-minute video of one or more of the authors, just really kind of describing in layman's terms, so what? How is this effective? What are the takeaways from this project, and how, you know, somebody would actually use it? Or why would anybody want to read your paper in the first place? Now, you understand why journals want to do this, right? Because they want to increase the readership. So, you know, so they want that for the readership, but we want it because we actually want people to, at least I do, I actually want people to read my stuff. So can I do like a video abstract, or just maybe translating my article that's published in this peer-reviewed journal, but then publish it also in Forbes magazine or maybe AL.com or something like that, so that it's available to a broader cross-section of the public. So that's the whole distribution part. The other part of distribution is, if we're engaging in a project, where are we going to engage with subjects? Is this more of a lab study? Is this going to be a field study? Is this a community-based participatory project? Is this something where we're actually going to go into a healthcare facility and collect the data? No, this is something that we have to be very clear about up front. And maybe it's a multi-stage project where we're going to do all of these. It's going to start as a lab study, and then after the lab study, we're going to replicate this in the field, and after that, we're going to replicate it into the community. Can we sketch out that translational pipeline up front? Being very clear on our revenue sources. So again, how I started this presentation is, yeah, we know that federal grants is something that a lot of us are working on, but are there other ways that we can fund our projects that maybe we can think creatively about? So maybe it's going to, you know, foundations. Maybe it's a Robert Wood Johnson or Kellogg Foundation or Ford Foundation. Maybe it's a local corporate foundation like Alabama Power Foundation or the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham. Maybe there are other funding sources that maybe we haven't thought about because, again, maybe we're just siloed. We're just accustomed to doing it the way that our advisor did it. But what happens if we bring other people onto the project that could help us think through other ways that we can fund our projects? And I submit to you that we're all going to be pushed to do this in this current federal funding environment that we're in. What about fee for service? Maybe some of you are working on projects to where maybe you can actually charge for some of the services that you're providing. Just a thought. Industry-sponsored research, I know some of you may be doing this, but what happens if we actually engage with a partner that says, you know what, I like that project, I'll fund your project up front, and then maybe that reduces your reliance on federal funding. And then what about other just intramural funding types of opportunities that we have here on campus? And then startup needs. Sometimes when you're actually coming into a new job, maybe you're going to have a startup fund. Maybe you're starting up something new. You're already in an organization, but you have a new idea for a new center or a new lab. What are the needs that you're going to have in order to get that thing going? Is it money? Is it equipment? Is it people? Is it space? Being very clear about what your needs are, and then creating a budget and a business case that you can then pitch to maybe your boss or your boss's boss or something like that to actually get started. And then once you get started, what are the recurring costs? So do we have to continue to pay salaries, pay rent to get equipment? And then other non-financial things like how much time is it actually going to take in order to get this project? I think oftentimes, at least in my early parts of my career and even now, I have really underestimated the amount of time it takes to get stuff done. It always takes twice as long. Or when I think about my pipeline, it's like, okay, I got 3 projects I'm working on, and you send these 3 projects out for review, and you're like, whew, now I can really start on that other project I really been want to work on. You start these other 2 projects, and then maybe you get 2 R&Rs and a reject. So now you got those 3 came back, and now you got 2 more that you put into the pipeline. Do you drop the 2 that you just started to go back and work on the R&Rs because you only have a 30 or 60-day turnaround? But then you got to teach classes as well. And then you get those out, and then they get the second round, and those get rejected, and so now it's like, how do I have time to get all this done? How did I find myself in this position? It happens all the time. So how can we be very clear about the amount of time that we have to work on our projects and to understand maybe there's some things that I just don't need to be working on. Maybe I need to go out and add other people to my team that can actually do this better than I can. As a PhD student, I was so accustomed to working with my advisor, being a person that designed the study, collected the data, analyzed the data, writing all that up because I had a research assistantship. That's what I was supposed to do. But now I'm a faculty member. I'm still doing all that. I'm like, why am I doing all this? Why am I not going out and finding other students, giving them opportunities, but also finding the funding that it takes in order to pay them so that they can get this experience, so they can offload me to engage in some of the other things that I probably should be doing, like the administrative part, the mentoring, things like that. So that's the transition that I'm in, is being very clear about my time and also my emotional energy. Stress and burnout are really important things, right, that all of us are dealing with. There's probably nobody in this room that works 40 hours a week, right? I know all of us are probably working 40, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. How can we be a lot more conscious about, are we stressing ourselves out? Are we, unnecessarily exhausting our emotional and mental resources? And how can we be more effective with that? What I would submit to you that we can be more effective with that by really developing effective teams, not micromanaging, trusting other people that they can get it done. Because sometimes you may think, I have to get this done because I'm the only person I trust. Maybe you're not that special. And that's something I had to tell myself, you're not that important, Anthony. You're not that important. You need to let somebody else do parts of these projects. All right. So that's about it. I'm probably going to stop right there, and I'll open it up for questions. So I've given you guys, just as a recap, I've told you about the 3 primary types of team conflicts: task conflict, relationship conflict, and process conflict. I've talked to you about the 5 manifestations of conflict, how conflict can be asymmetric, conflict can transform, conflict can be multiplex such that conflicts can, often co-occur with friendship. I've given you this tool about the task, expertise, and people. That's what we call transactive memory systems. And so that's a useful tool when you're working on your projects, to be very clear about what needs to be done, what expertise is needed, and who has expertise to get what things done. and then this final tool is the business model canvas. Being very clear up front about this, and the thing I love about this, it's almost like a one-page business plan. You know, oftentimes people come to me and they say, Dr. Hood, can you write a business plan for my organization? Now, I charge to write business plans, okay? So there are times where I would charge people to write business plans, but what I found is that if I write you a business plan, it's not really your plan. It ends up being my plan, and they don't have a lot of emotional connection to it. And so what I found is that oftentimes business plans end up being an exercise in creative writing. It's a huge document that nobody ever reads. Okay, you might read it once, it goes on the shelf. What this does is give you this one page to where you can just put bullet points on it, and it really illustrates just the fundamental assumptions of the projects that you're working on. And it's something that can be shared amongst all team members. And then this is something that I recommend to the teams that I work with. You bring this with you to every team project that you're working on, so that we don't go down these rabbit holes. The other thing I always recommend to teams is have an agenda. I've got to the place where I don't show up to meetings if there's not an agenda, because it's just a waste of my time, okay? But if there is an agenda, the mission statement of the organization should be at the top of the agenda. That makes sure that everybody's still focused on why are we here and what are we here to do. And so when you think about the teams that you're working on, the labs that you're working in, is there an overarching mission or vision for the lab? If it's a sub-project within that lab, is there an overall mission or vision for the projects that you're working on? Why are we actually engaging in this? Because this will help reduce the amount of conflict, because it trains people to why we're here and why we're doing it. Accompany this with that agenda, and I think this will help resolve a lot of the problems that you may have and actually push you to a higher level of performance. When people are clear about who's the customer, what's the customer's problem, what's the solution, why are we doing this, what's the benefit, what's the advantage, what's our brand, what's the distribution, how are we going to pay for this, are there different ways we can pay for it, how do we get started, and then what are the other expenses that we're going to occur over the lifespan of this project. Having this one page with you, I think, will help tremendously. So I'll stop there, and I'll entertain any questions that you have. I guess I may need to check to see if there are any questions online too, right, Gene?
Is there someone we can get this business model canvas?
Yeah, I can. We can make sure you get an electronic copy of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also a website, costarters.co, where you can download a copy of this document. I didn't create this document. This is a document that was created by an organization called CoStarters. Question to you, how are you going to use anything that you heard today? You think there's something that you can go back this week and actually do something different that may help your projects?
Do you have your questionnaire for your study on the teams?
Yes. That's another thing that I learned early in my career, is having one central place where I have all of my questionnaires, because there are times where I have other colleagues that say, hey, I got an opportunity to go into this organization and collect some data. Is there any data that you need to be collected while I'm going in there? As a matter of fact, I do. I'll email it to you in a few minutes. So yeah, I have a central place where I keep all my questionnaires. All right, well, there are no questions. I'll hang around if you want to talk one-on-one. I'd be more than happy to do that. You guys should have my contact information on the slide, so feel free to reach out to me. Usually when I do these presentations, somebody usually reaches out to me and say, hey, can you come in and maybe do a presentation to my individual work group or to my team. I'm more than happy to do that. And the last thing I want to say is I want to appreciate the CCTS. They actually cover part of my effort to make myself available to do these team science workshops around campus. So I do these for pediatrics, children's, department of surgery. I've done these all over campus. I'm more than happy to do these with your groups as well. Thank you.